All right, guys, this is part 2 of 5.3. We're kind of getting into mainly the topics and discussing, what is causing this, soil loss as well as soil erosion, desertification, salinization, absolutely, and just the activities that are kind of, in enabling it, right? We've, in the last lecture, we really talked about the commercial versus the low scale or small scale type agricultural farming, right? Just know that they both have detrimental effects to the environment. What we're currently doing is just not, we're looking out for more for profit versus the actual longevity of, of soil as well as the ground we live on. There's always this kind of want to, get as much as we possibly can out of the soil without actually, extending its life, right? So we're thinking very short term versus long term. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind when we're kind of going through this. There is quite a lot of reading in this one. I'm not going to read every slide for slide. I do recommend that you kind of go through them to really understand these processes, because we're going to kind of really talk about the key points, that I'm making sure that you kind of realize for IB. But I would definitely, if you want, take your time, put me on pause whenever you need to, right? But it's important to know that, when you reduce the fertility of soil, when you bring down the quality of soil, it has disastrous consequences. We get erosion, toxification, salinization, and desertification, right? And in this one, we kind of talked about commercial farming in the last one, but this one we're going to kind of speak on. We're going to kind of go back and forth in between both those, but this for right now, we'll kind of discuss why low scale farms also have a disastrous impact on the soil. And really what it gets down to is you have poor people trying to make as much money as they possibly can. They think short term rather than long term, right? When you're trying to feed your family, it is not in your mind what's going to happen to the soil in 5 to 10 years, right? You're thinking about, how am I going to get food on the table? That is key when you kind of keep this in mind. And I hope you keep that in mind when we're going through all the units, right? This has come up repeatedly about why, people aren't going to care about the environment if they can't feed their family, kind of thing, right? But what we're arguing as an environmental scientist, as in environmental science, is that it's going to cost more in the future if we don't make changes. So you might see short-term gains, but in the long run, it's actually going to have much more impact on even your wallet, not just the environment, right? So, kind of this one really just talks about, using cattle or sheep or, grazing animals as an example. A farmer is going to want to fatten them up as soon as possible, right? So they're not going to, and they might be losing land, right? There's more and more people on this planet, so those cattle have to stay in one area. So the result is you have farmers that these small time farmers that leave their cattle in one area and they graze there. They can no longer go from place to place to place. Why? Because there's so many more cattle out there. There's so many more people. So they end up staying in a place. Well, when they're so confined, the cattle tend to eat everything, right? Down to the ground. And that has a disastrous consequences on an ecosystem or environment, right? You're eating maybe trees are sprouting, but as soon as they sprout, they're getting eaten by the cattle. And these have long-term effects that in all honesty, the cattle or these grazing animals pretty much completely wipe out an ecosystem, right? It doesn't allow it to grow back. And not only that, but it wipes out an ecosystem that had future or potential because you're getting rid of the seeds as well. So poor management practices can lead to low organic matter. This results in poor water infiltration, and then poor water drainage does not, saturated soil or compaction, right? So when you take away all the plants, then you're having just runoff. Even when it does rain, where you need that, that water in the soil, instead of seeping in the soil, now it just runs off because there's nothing catching it. And it's just there's these cycles that then, these positive feedback loops then start due to these things, right? And desertification is the accumulated result of ill-adapted land use and the effects of harsh climate, right? Human activities represent the most immediate causes. So we have overcultivation, exhaustive soil, right? You're trying to get too much from it too quickly, right? Overgrazing, we talked about that. Deforestation, right? Slash and burn techniques, we've talked about that before. And then how, that eventually leads to, then it just leads to in environments where you're getting too much leaching, and then the soil is pretty much dead after a couple of years. Lack of education is definitely the biggest one, right? Farmers not knowing how to cultivate and keep their soil practical, right? And then movement of refugees in case of war, right? You have maybe, developments in a country. So the soil is continually changing. It's going from one hand to the next. So you don't have these long-term practices set up where it's very temporary. So you might have a new farmer and they're that, oh, I'm going to get as much as I possibly can out of this land. Then they leave. Then the next year you're like, then there's a new farmer and, well, what am I going to do, right? It's kind of the same thing. This process keeps leading on and on and on. It's important to think about this, right? Think about the economic impacts and these cycles that happen due to this. And this is just kind of an example, but the Sahel is, really what's going on. We have an increase of the Sahara desert, and this is happening all over the world. So this is not just the only example. But as you can see, the Sahara desert is continually growing at a rapid rate. And it's really due to, the farmers or communities that are not taking soil into consideration when they're doing the things they do, right? They're overexploiting it. And then just not allowing the soil to regenerate. No longer organic material is going into the soil, and as a consequence, the soil is unable to recover. And really, what you're having is this huge grand scale desertification that's happening for the Sahara. The Sahara desert is continually growing southward, where once used to be beautiful, lush forests, now are getting kind of sucked up into the desert because it's growing because of these practices. Now, there is we just don't have time, but there's a great documentary. I forget what it's called, The Green Belt. What's happening is you do have certain farmers that are trying to band together, and they're growing a long line of trees to stop the Sahara desert, which is great. But as you can see, let's say you're trying to grow a long line of trees, because it need to be a set form. Think of an army line, right? Any little small, break in that line can cause the enemy to go past you, right? So you need this continuous line of trees. Well, we know that's not easy. Look, how many countries are involved in this? Some of these countries are unstable, right? So imagine, if Mali's farmers were really getting together and trying to grow this line of trees, well, then, what happens in Niger definitely affects them, because then the desert can kind of go around that, right? So this is an issue that's happening in the world. There are ways of dealing with this. This kind of goes into the last unit as well, where you should kind of there are techniques of what we can do to stop soil from erosion, right? There are different ways using organic materials, lime, wind breaks, shelter belts. Those are kind of what's they're building in the Green Mile, where you're growing these trees to stop the wind from blowing through and picking up away the soil. You have terracing, contour plowing, where you're kind of breaking the land into these kind of strips due to elevation. And what that does is that slows down the water erosion, right? Because water then pours in with one, so instead of rushing down the side of a mountain, it's getting stopped kind of like steps, where it kind of puddles up and holds on to some of that water. So there are many different types, right? So we can kind of go through them, but we have soil conditioners, use of lime and organic material. So you're putting the lime and organic material back into the soil rather than just using fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Wind reduction, right, to stop winds. We kind of talked about that. Cultivation techniques, right, terracing, contour plowing, plowing with the hill rather than going in straight lines. You're kind of going along, but you're going with the elevation, so it kind of keeps that more of a step type of process, which holds on to water. Efforts to stop plowing of marginal lands, right? Not just completely plowing over a whole swath of land, because then it's all bare, and then you have wind that can pick that up, or water, instead of doing it kind of more in bands or taking a step-by-step process. Trickle dripping, which you're watering your plants or actually putting water directly into the soil rather than spraying. Spraying is actually one of the worst. I just remember growing up and you see these huge spraying systems that spray water. Well, they're actually horrible, right? Because most of the water is getting evaporated before it even hits the plants or gets into the soil. So putting the water directly into the soil then, makes it sticky, holds it down rather than, conserving more water as well, right? And loss of evaporation. And there's many different ways. Here's another list. And once again, I don't mean to rush through them. It's just, there's quite a big list. So I recommend you kind of understanding these. And I think your workbook definitely makes you kind of go through these as well. But mechanical methods, right? So even if you have a commercial farming, you can, terracing, contour plowing, go slow down the movement of rain down the slopes, right? You don't want just a steep slope. The more gradual decline it is, the better it's going to hold on to the water. Vegetation, using different vegetation type methods. When you have, let's say you're growing corn in an area, well, when it's the off season, when you're not growing corn, throw something else on there that will hold down that soil so it's not just eroded during the off time. Soil husbandry is used to prevent damage to soil structure. Caretaking use, reduce the use of heavy machinery, right? Because then heavy machinery just kind of cuts up the soil and then it just becomes more loose, which then can make it erode much quicker. The three main ways of managing salt affected soils, so to make sure that you don't get salinization of the soil, is flushing the soil with water and leaching the salt away every once in a while. Using gypsum and calcium sulfates to replace sodium ions on the clay and colloids. Okay, I'm probably not saying that right? But then reduction of evaporation losses, right? So, how you water the soil will definitely change that, right? Because remember, we know that's with salt water, right? When you're spraying, all water has a little minuscule amounts of salt in it. And when it evaporates, it leaves that salt behind. And just think of over, a couple seasons, that salt builds up. And just, kind of go on to there, but, really building up an education system for people as well will have huge, interest in producing more food, but also saving the soil in the long term. I'm definitely not go through this, but because you're going to go through this with your workbook, but this is part of your case study that you'll kind of look at. I think the workbook is mainly all case studies this time. There's 3 different case studies, if I believe correctly, so you can kind of use these for that, right? And to talk about that. But these are just different types of ways. The one I do want to stress here, though, is, the biggest problem I see with, think back to that very beginning unit. You probably don't remember this, but it was last year at the beginning of the course. We had that, what do we have now versus what we had. So think of a forest that has many different organisms in it, right? Well, then you cut that down and you put one organism, like a crop. That's called monocultural, monocultivating, right? Monoagriculture. So I know where I grew up, once again, I'm throwing that there, but there was always, in a field, there was always corn, right? And what the farmers would do then, to fertilize the heck out of it and then keep growing corn, right? Which is a very, very bad way. You have one type of crop. What we should be doing is utilizing that land and growing a mixture of crops. If we could better do that, different crops leave or help the soil in different ways. Switching out between crops would really greatly help there. And farm, kind of this one goes into kind of commercial farming systems and, between subsistence farming. But this is kind of another case study, but it talks about the North American prairie and commercial farming. We have just increasing salinity and soil erosion we have a loss of soil fertility, right? Just doing things in different methods. And I think I already stressed all these, so I don't need to go through them more. But contour, cropping, so we can see in this photo where you're kind of going in different kind of a circular line rather than a straight and forward line. Well, what that does is that slows down water and wind erosion, right? So working with the slope rather than against it. And then just, we've talked about all those, making sure we don't have a buildup of soil as well on the, no, buildup of salt on the soil. Sorry, it's one of those days, right? But yeah, kind of those methods, and I guess that's it. That's my lecture today. So nothing too bad, guys. There are, the ones I really stressed in this lecture are the ones that are going to keep popping up again and again. When you're doing your case study today, how I really recommend it is, even in the future IB tests as well as my test, be ready to, what'll more likely be is, explain several ways that farmers can save the soil in, let's say a very traditional farm, very low scale farming, and how could they save soil in a commercial type environment. Think about that question, right? And be able to answer it and argue your point. What are certain methods? Maybe I would suggest knowing 3 of them, right, for each, and slightly different ones for each, that you could explain how to save soil. And that's probably where the biggest hint or biggest thing I would say take from this lecture and this 5.3. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your workbook. I hope it's not too stressful. But case studies are always important, especially through IB. Be ready to really answer those questions well. Defend your answers, right? And explain it. Make sure you fully explain those questions. Just kind of looking back at the past workbooks, I think some of the big points we kind of lack. So I'm trying to really tell you what is expected of you, right? So this way a little bit more. That is it. Take care. Have an awesome day. It looks like I'm almost bald in here with all the lighting kind of thing in my blonde hair. Don't make fun of me. I'm not going bald like Mr. Brian, all right? I'm not nearly that bad. You just can't see it because of the lighting. But anyway, have a great day. And see you later. Take care.